Today we want to talk about micro to macro. Now when we say micro, we really are using a term that denotes focused in on an individual. And most services for people with disabilities, and most services for really most all vulnerable people, really come from a micro perspective. That is, they look at the individual as having some kind of a problem or an issue, and then really focus on changing that person. Now the micro approach can be helpful in some arenas or some areas where individuals really do need some things to enhance their functionality. However, we at CLASS really believe that more important is understanding macro change. Today I want to illustrate with you in a very, very short way the difference between micro and macro change. So let's take a look at kind of a framework of understanding micro to macro. First off, we're showing this graph that has on the axis side the number of people, and then down on the abscissa side we have a range of people. And the example that I want to show with you today is perhaps a variation or deviation of people related to cognition. You know, in our society we do IQ tests. We test people's intellectual functioning, and that usually happens in school. And what happens with the measuring of intellectual functioning over a community or a classroom or a school district or a society for that matter is you really begin to see differences in people's functionality. So if we did an IQ test, and most people watching this video probably have taken an IQ test, you know that the score range is anywhere from 0 at this point all the way to 200 on a Stanford-Binet test. So you can get this kind of a pretty big range. Now, in giving a Stanford-Binet, when you took your IQ test, you fell somewhere in this range, depending upon your ability to answer the questions. And typically what happens when we look at a whole society is we begin to see kind of a bell curve reality. That is, we see the most amount of people on any kind of an analysis, and of course on a Stanford-Binet, falling at what we consider to be a middle road or a median. Let's just, for purposes of this video, say that this is 100. Right? So the most amount of people score 100 on an IQ test. These other sides of the distribution are what we call the skewed sides, where we have deviance, we have difference from what is considered to be the norm, right? Now the word norm comes from normal, right? And normal means right in the middle of the pack. It doesn't mean necessarily good or bad. It means the most amount of people, the highest number of people score in this kind of a zone. Now, where this really becomes important in terms of the work that we do at CLASS is we know that there is an arbitrary definition of acceptance that unfolds in terms of who is perceived to be in the norm, right? So this gap between this point and this point is really a parameter of acceptance, or what is perceived to be normal, right? This differentiation from here to here. Now in micro change, right? In micro change, what we really begin to do is we find people usually on the skewed side. So many of the people watching this video might serve people with intellectual disabilities whose score would actually be below what is considered to be normal, which is the score of 70. 70 is considered to be the cutoff point between what is normal and what is abnormal or different or deviant, right? Now, what happens when people score on this side of the equation is they're labeled, right? They're given a name, and actually in our society, we call people who score below 70 as having intellectual disability. We used to use the word retardation or retarded to describe that. We don't use that word anymore. It's really not perceived to be an appropriate word, but we did use that word. And so people who score on this side are often labeled. Oftentimes they're devalued, right? They're looked down upon, or they're seen as less than the people from the norm. Now, interestingly enough, in this example, if somebody scores 140 or higher, that is, they're on the deviant side of the bell curve, they're also labeled. These people are usually called genius, right? Or gifted is the term that we hear. And these people are oftentimes hypervalued. In other words, their value is actually gone up. So this is sort of a macro display of how people might score. Now, micro change efforts really begin to look at the person who is dysfunctional, who is outside of the norm, and in some ways fix that person to function in the norm. So then we might try to fix somebody, really help them, change them, right? And that's micro change efforts. However, macro perspectives really begin to say that the issue is not the person, it really is the perceived difference. And so in macro change, what we're really trying to do, quite simply, is to literally take these lines and move them out. That is, make a greater norm. We want to literally change the perspective of society in a broader way. Now, macro change really has two pieces of the puzzle to it. One is we've got to understand the rules, right? If we look at this note, what has been identified to be the reason why somebody is perceived as different? And so we've got to look at what are the rules, or what are the society's determinants, and perhaps change these rules, right? So again, if you go back to a disability example, what we did by passing the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was a macro change effort to really try to change the rules so that all people might be incorporated or included. The second piece, however, of macro change that we've been looking at CLASS is really the development of social capital. And that is helping people build relationships. Because we know when people build relationships, literally, it changes people's attitudes. If you look at the changes that have happened in society around gay marriage, for example, we see that actually society is becoming more and more accepting of what was perceived to be different, and literally was regulated out by rules and laws in society. And yet, we're seeing that change. Not so much by passing a law, for example, like DOMA, but we're really seeing that those lines go out primarily because people are building relationships with folks who happen to be gay, and recognizing that it is really not that big of a deal. So as we think about change, here at CLASS, we are really focused on looking at macro change efforts. How do we change the greater society? How do we change the attitudes and perceptions? If you want to know more about how we're doing that, please take a look at our website, classcommunity.org, or follow us on Twitter at Class Pittsburgh. At Class Pittsburgh, there's our handle for Twitter. Our website, classcommunity.org. We would love to tell you more about the things we're doing. Thanks so much for your efforts. Good luck to you as you get out there and try to change the world. Thank you.